Is that your rank, Grandpa? Tyler Brooks' voice cut through the bustling mess hall, sharp and laced with the kind of arrogance only youth can afford, making the chatter of mid-morning trays and silverware clatter suddenly feel distant. At the corner table, a lone figure sat, almost imperceptible amid the surge of sailors grabbing coffee and eggs, his posture relaxed but deliberate, fingers resting lightly on the edge of his worn leather satchel. Walter Hayes, 86, white hair thin at the temples, pale blue eyes calm and assessing, barely acknowledged the intrusion, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from a cup of black coffee in front of him, the aroma mingling with the faint scent of fried eggs and toast. Tyler leaned forward, smirking, leaning an elbow on the table edge as if he owned the space. "So, what branch were you in, old man?" he jabbed, voice loud enough for the surrounding sailors to catch and grin at the apparent joke. Walter's hands moved slowly, picking up the cup, the motion unhurried, deliberate, sending a silent pulse of control through the air. "Nothing." Tyler's smirk widened as he leaned back, signaling his friends, a few younger sailors chuckling, not noticing how still the room had begun to feel, the hum of conversations tapering to hushed glances. "Let me guess, just a cook or some desk job?" Tyler continued, his tone meant to provoke laughter, the kind that comes from the assumption that age alone equals insignificance. Walter shifted slightly, adjusting the edge of his satchel, his movements precise, eyes never leaving the cup, lips barely moving, exuding a quiet, contained authority that contradicted every ounce of Tyler's insolence. Around them, the ambient noise of the hall seemed to blur, forks paused mid-air, the distant clang of a tray forgotten, as if the room itself was leaning closer, waiting for some unspoken truth. Tyler's friends nudged him, encouragement in their eyes, yet even they sensed a subtle weight in the air, a presence that made the bravado feel thin and exposed. Walter finally lifted his head, eyes meeting Tyler's directly, and the faintest arch of a brow was enough to make the seal falter, just a fraction, before Walter spoke, calm, even, his voice low and measured. "I retired as commander. Call sign Black Raven 6. The words landed like a stone in a quiet pond, ripples spreading instantly as the Master Chief at the end of the hall froze, recognition cutting through years of routine and chatter. The tables shifted subtly, sailors pausing mid-bite, some lowering mugs, others straightening in their seats, the ambient hum dropping to a tense silence, as if every ear strained to catch what came next. Walter set the cup down with deliberate precision, the soft clink against the saucer marking the moment of transition, a quiet signal that the room's dynamics had irrevocably changed. Tyler opened his mouth, a retort forming, but the calm, unyielding gaze of Walter, combined with the silent acknowledgement from Master Chief Ethan Cole across the hall, stole the words before they could escape. The mess hall, once full of laughter and light conversation, now held its collective breath, the hum of fluorescent lights above seeming to dim in contrast to the intensity focused on the lone veteran whose mere presence, measured, deliberate, and unwavering, had commanded attention, respect, and an unspoken understanding that some histories demand silence, and that sometimes the weight of experience alone is enough to freeze an entire room. Walter Hayes set his cup down, the faint clink echoing across the mess hall, drawing the eyes of a few nearby sailors who had not yet realized the shift in atmosphere. The Master Chief, Ethan Cole, leaned slightly forward from the far end of the hall, eyes narrowing as recognition flared across his face. The quiet weight of history seemed to settle between the tables, folding the room into a tense stillness that pressed on Tyler Brooks and his companions. Walter's hands, though lined with age, moved with the precision of someone accustomed to deliberate action, adjusting the satchel strap over his shoulder, eyes scanning briefly over the room as if noting the reactions of each individual present. The ambient noise of chairs scraping and trays sliding across counters had dimmed, replaced by a palpable expectancy that made Tyler shift uncomfortably in his seat, realizing the joke he intended was no longer on him. Ethan Cole's fingers hovered over the intercom panel on the wall, subtle but intentional, a silent communication being initiated without the awareness of the young SEAL. The air carried a faint mix of coffee and toasted bread, yet it seemed overlaid with something heavier, a sense of significance that had settled invisibly across the tables. Walter's gaze remained calm, almost meditative, as he traced the edge of the cup with a single finger, his posture unyielding yet relaxed, conveying authority without words. Tyler glanced toward his friends, the confidence in his eyes wavering as he noted the stillness around them. The subtle exchange between Walter and Ethan Cole becoming increasingly evident. The Master Chief's expression, a mixture of astonishment and recognition, created a ripple that spread to the adjacent tables, sailors beginning to lower their trays, utensils resting midair, attention drawn involuntarily to the veteran who had become the center of gravity in the room. Walter shifted his seat slightly, enough to align himself directly with Tyler, his eyes locking onto the younger man with a calm intensity that conveyed understanding beyond spoken language, an unspoken challenge that Tyler felt in the pit of his stomach. The mess hall seemed to slow, each movement deliberate, each glance carrying weight, as Ethan Cole quietly activated a secure line, his thumb moving swiftly over the buttons while keeping his actions hidden from the unsuspecting seal. The subtle click of the line being engaged was masked by the ambient sounds, yet its presence added an invisible tension, a chain reaction beginning to unfold as Walter's calm presence dominated the room, silently commanding respect and attention. Tyler's attempts to maintain composure faltered slightly, a subtle tightening of his jaw and a flicker of uncertainty passing across his face. The young SEAL now fully aware that the situation had shifted beyond his control. Around them, the room had taken on a stillness that made the clatter of trays and the murmur of conversation seem distant, almost irrelevant, as if the mess hall itself had become a stage for the revelation that was quietly unfolding. Walter's hands rested once again on the table, fingers interlaced, a serene poise that contrasted sharply with the tension rippling from Tyler, each sailor now sensing that something significant had been set into motion, a quiet authority emanating from a man whose age belied the command he still held over those who thought they were in control. The subtle exchange between Master Chief Cole and the secure line, the veteran's composed demeanor, and the gradual awareness spreading through the hall coalesced into an invisible but undeniable tension, an anticipation that kept everyone motionless, waiting for the next beat in a story that had already begun to unfold in silence and authority. Master Chief Ethan Cole stepped away from the far table with the measured pace of a man who had learned long ago that urgency did not require speed. His boots crossed the polished floor without drawing attention, but several sailors noticed him moving and immediately sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Ethan stopped near the service counter and turned slightly away from the room, the secure phone pressed against his ear. His expression remained controlled, yet the muscles along his jaw had tightened. On the other end of the line, a duty officer at Naval Personnel Archives answered with routine confidence. That confidence lasted less than 30 seconds. Ethan quietly repeated the words Black Raven 6. Silence followed. Then came the sound of keys striking a keyboard. Another pause, longer this time. Ethan listened without speaking, his eyes drifting toward Walter Hayes. The old veteran remained seated exactly where he had been, calm and unbothered, as if none of this concerned him. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Around him, active duty sailors sat straighter. Conversations had completely disappeared. Even Tyler Brooks could feel it now. Something had gone wrong, although he could not yet understand how. He folded his arms and tried to recover his confidence, but every glance from the surrounding tables seemed to make the room feel smaller. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you certain?" The answer on the other end caused his eyes to widen slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. The duty officer was no longer speaking with casual professionalism. He sounded careful, respectful, almost nervous. Ethan ended the call and immediately dialed another number. This one connected directly to a restricted command office located 3 buildings away. A commander answered. Ethan repeated the same call sign. The reaction was even more alarming. The commander interrupted him before he could finish. Questions followed. Rapid questions. Ethan answered each one while never taking his eyes off Walter. The old veteran reached for his coffee again and took a slow sip. Nothing about him suggested someone at the center of a growing chain reaction. Tyler finally pushed back from the table. "What is this?" he asked, attempting a laugh. "Some old retirement story?" No one laughed with him. The absence of support hit harder than any response could have. A nearby chief petty officer looked away rather than meet his eyes. Another sailor quietly stood and moved to a different table, as if instinct told him he was witnessing something important. Ethan ended the second call. Less than 10 seconds later, his own phone vibrated. Then again. Messages were arriving faster than he could open them. Classification notices, personnel references, historical records. Most contained heavy redactions. Entire sections blacked out. Dates without explanations. Operations without locations. Yet one detail appeared repeatedly. Black Raven 6. Ethan had served 28 years in the Navy. He had seen legends become stories and stories become myths. Yet this name surfaced in files usually reserved for senior command review. The realization settled heavily on him. Across the hall, Walter quietly adjusted the sleeve of his faded jacket. A small movement, almost insignificant. Yet Ethan suddenly understood that everyone in the room had made the same mistake. They had judged age. They had judged appearance. They had assumed the story was over. In reality, they had only just reached the beginning. The messages continued arriving faster than Master Chief Ethan Cole could read them. Each notification seemed to deepen the silence spreading through the mess hall. He opened another personnel summary and immediately understood why every office he had contacted reacted the same way. The file was old, older than most sailors currently stationed on base. Entire sections had been sealed. Operation names had been removed. Locations had disappeared behind black bars. Yet scattered between the redactions were fragments that painted an unsettling picture. Commendations, special assignments, direct attachments to commands that rarely appeared in conventional records. Ethan slowly lowered the phone. The room around him felt different now. Not louder, quieter, more careful. Walter Hayes remained seated exactly where he had been from the beginning. He had not asked for attention. He had not corrected anyone. He had not even defended himself. The realization bothered Ethan more than anything he had discovered in the files. The old veteran had known exactly what would happen when he spoke that call sign, and yet he had delivered it without pride, without challenge, and without the slightest interest in impressing anyone. Across the hall, Tyler Brooks attempted to regain control of the situation. He forced a smile and looked toward his teammates. "Come on," he said. "Nobody has heard of this guy until 5 minutes ago." His words landed awkwardly. One of the younger sailors nearby immediately looked away. Another shifted in his seat and pretended to focus on his meal. The reaction only made Tyler more uncomfortable. He had spent years building confidence through achievement and discipline. Now that confidence was being slowly eroded by something he could not see or understand. Ethan's phone rang again. This time the caller identification displayed a command office number. He answered immediately. The officer on the other end did not waste time with introductions. "Is he there right now?" Ethan glanced toward Walter. "Yes, sir." A brief silence followed. Then came a response that caused Ethan to straighten instinctively. "Do not let him leave." The call ended. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds. He had expected confirmation. He had expected clarification. He had not expected urgency. The words echoed in his mind. "Do not let him leave." Nearby, sunlight filtered through the tall windows overlooking the harbor. The bright reflection danced across rows of polished tables and uniforms, creating an almost surreal contrast to the growing tension inside the building. Walter quietly folded a napkin and placed it beside his empty plate. His movements remained calm, methodical, and unhurried. He looked like a grandfather finishing breakfast. Nothing more. Yet somewhere beyond the walls of the mess hall, senior officers were suddenly rearranging schedules because of his presence. Ethan walked slowly toward Walter's table. The surrounding sailors tracked every step. Tyler did the same. The veteran noticed him approaching and looked up with the faintest hint of recognition in his pale blue eyes. Before Ethan could speak, Walter offered a small smile. It was not the smile of a man surprised by recent events. It was the smile of someone who had seen this pattern before. Someone who understood that certain names never truly disappeared. They only waited for the right person to remember them. Master Chief Ethan Cole stopped beside the table, and for a moment neither man spoke. The silence between them felt different from the silence that filled the rest of the room. It was the silence of recognition. Ethan had spent nearly 3 decades around sailors, officers, and legends whose names lived on in stories passed through generations. Yet standing beside Walter Hayes, he felt something he had not experienced in years. Humility. Walter looked up from the table and studied him with calm eyes that seemed untouched by the growing tension around them. "You found something," Walter said quietly. It was not a question. Ethan gave a slow nod. "Yes, sir." The title slipped out before he could stop it. Several sailors nearby immediately noticed. Tyler Brooks noticed too. His expression hardened. Until that moment, he had convinced himself there was a simple explanation. Some administrative error. Some exaggerated record. Something ordinary. But hearing a Master Chief address the old veteran with genuine respect shattered that illusion. Walter offered a faint smile. "It has been a long time since anyone called me that." Ethan pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Around them, the mess hall remained frozen in anticipation. No one wanted to leave. No one wanted to miss what happened next. Ethan lowered his voice. "The files are heavily restricted." Walter nodded once. "I figured they still would be. Most of the operation names are sealed." Walter looked out the window toward the harbor where sunlight reflected off distant water. "That is probably for the best." Ethan studied him carefully. There was no pride in his answers. No attempt to build mystery. The old veteran seemed almost relieved that the details remained hidden. That realization disturbed Ethan more than the records themselves. Most people wanted their accomplishments remembered. Walter appeared perfectly comfortable letting history forget him. Across the hall, Tyler finally stood up. The movement drew attention from several nearby tables. "What exactly are we talking about here?" he asked. His voice carried farther than he intended. Nobody answered. Tyler looked from sailor to sailor, searching for support. Instead, he found uncertainty, respect, curiosity, everything except agreement. Walter turned toward him. His expression remained kind. "Nothing important, son." The answer only made Tyler more uncomfortable. Ethan almost laughed. The records he had read suggested the exact opposite. His phone vibrated again. Another incoming call. This time the caller identification displayed a Flag Officer Command Office. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Calls from that office did not happen by accident. He answered immediately. A calm voice spoke on the other end. Precise, professional, direct. Ethan listened for several seconds without interruption. Then he slowly stood from his chair. The color drained from his face. Every sailor watching noticed it. Walter noticed it too. Ethan lowered the phone and looked at the veteran. "Sir," he said carefully, "Rear Admiral Robert Kane is on his way here right now." For the first time since entering the mess hall, a subtle change crossed Walter Hayes's face. Not fear, not excitement, just the faintest trace of memory, as though a door long closed had quietly opened somewhere far in the distance. Then he looked back toward the harbor and softly said, "Robert made Admiral." Good for him. The effect on the room was immediate. Several sailors exchanged stunned glances, while others simply stared at Walter Hayes as if seeing him for the first time. Rear Admiral Robert Kane was not a name that casually appeared in ordinary conversations, and certainly not because he was personally traveling to a mess hall. Tyler Brooks felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had expected explanations. He had expected clarification. Instead, every answer seemed to create even larger questions. Walter, however, remained completely at ease. He folded his hands together and looked out through the tall windows where a pair of gulls drifted above the harbor on the afternoon breeze. The sunlight reflected off the water in bright flashes of silver. For a moment, he seemed far away from the growing tension around him. Master Chief Ethan Cole remained standing beside the table. His years of experience told him something important. This situation was no longer moving through normal channels. The calls had come too quickly. The reactions had been too immediate. Somewhere higher in the chain of command, people had recognized the name Black Raven 6 long before the records had fully surfaced. Ethan's phone vibrated once more. Another message. This one contained only a short note. Confirm identity immediately. Maintain presence until arrival. Ethan read the words twice before locking the screen. Across the hall, sailors who had originally been focused on lunch now sat motionless. The entire room seemed suspended between curiosity and disbelief. Tyler finally stepped forward. His confidence was fading, but pride would not allow him to retreat. "Who are you?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Walter slowly turned toward him. His expression remained patient. "Just an old sailor." A few people almost smiled at the answer. Tyler did not. No, he said. Nobody sends an admiral for just an old sailor. Walter looked at him for several seconds. There was no anger in his eyes. No satisfaction. Only understanding. Sometimes people remember things differently than the people who live them, he said quietly. The response only deepened the mystery. Ethan watched carefully. Walter was revealing almost nothing, yet every word carried weight. It was the kind of calm confidence that could not be taught. Outside, a low rumble drifted across the harbor. At first it blended into the ordinary sounds of the base. Then another sound followed. Vehicle engines. Several sailors near the windows turned their heads. One stood and moved closer to the glass. His eyes widened. "Sir," he whispered. Others followed his gaze. A small convoy had entered the road leading toward the mess hall. Dark vehicles moved with deliberate purpose, escorted by base security. The sight alone was enough to send another wave of silence through the room. Tyler felt his pulse quicken. Ethan already knew who it had to be. Walter simply glanced toward the windows before returning his attention to the now empty coffee cup in front of him. The convoy continued its approach. Closer. Nearer. Every second seemed to stretch longer than the last. The sailors no longer pretended to eat. Trays sat untouched. Conversations had completely disappeared. The entire hall was listening to the distant engines. Waiting. Watching. And for the first time since entering the building, Tyler Brooks began to realize that the story he thought he understood had never been his story at all. The convoy slowed to a halt outside the mess hall. The vehicles lined up with an exacting precision that commanded immediate attention without a single word spoken. Sunlight glinted off the polished surfaces, and the sound of engines idling seemed to vibrate through the floor, carrying tension into every corner of the room. Walter Hayes remained seated, calm and deliberate, his pale blue eyes tracking the vehicles as if he could see every movement before it happened. Master Chief Ethan Cole stepped back slightly, allowing the room to observe the subtle interaction between the veteran and the arriving command detail. Tyler Brooks stood frozen near the center of the hall, a tray still in his hands, his bravado completely muted by the weight of anticipation. Sailors nearby had instinctively straightened in their seats, their attention shifting fully toward Walter, sensing that the ordinary routines of their day had been interrupted by something far larger. A door at the end of the hall opened, and the first figure of the arriving team stepped inside. The presence alone drew a sharp intake of breath from those nearest the entrance. Walter did not rise, did not move. He simply looked toward the door with the calm confidence of a man fully aware of what his reputation carried, even when so few present had any real knowledge of it. Ethan Cole made a small gesture with his hand, subtle but commanding, indicating that the sequence was unfolding as expected. Tyler's eyes darted between the approaching figures and the veteran, uncertainty making him fidget. The first officer in the detail approached cautiously, scanning the room with practiced discipline, then stopped abruptly, recognition flashing across his face. He froze for a moment, then straightened and nodded in silent acknowledgement, as though a chain reaction of recognition had begun. Other members of the detail followed, their movements deliberate, methodical, and impeccably timed, each one attuned to the unspoken commands that seemed to emanate from Walter Hayes himself. The tension in the mess hall was now tangible, like a drawn bowstring ready to release, each sailor acutely aware of the historical significance unfolding before them. Tyler's attempt at a smile faltered completely as he realized that every assumption he had made about the veteran's insignificance had been wrong. Ethan watched carefully, noting the subtle cues of respect, the minute gestures that indicated recognition of authority far beyond what Tyler could comprehend. Walter shifted slightly, adjusting his jacket, his movements small, precise, and unhurried, yet commanding in their effect. The officers in the detail paused just short of his table, forming an almost protective perimeter without a word, as if the veteran's presence alone dictated the structure of the room. Every sailor, every observer, understood that a quiet command had been asserted, and the ordinary hierarchy of the mess hall had been replaced by the respect that history and experience demanded. The convoy outside and the officers inside created a frame around Walter, emphasizing the gravity of his position, and the room seemed to hold its breath, collectively acknowledging that an extraordinary figure, long overlooked and underestimated, had quietly returned to a space that now waited on his next move. The sound of the convoy had grown closer, a subtle rhythm of engines and tires against asphalt that threaded its way into the mess hall and held every occupant in suspended attention. Walter Hayes remained seated, calm and measured, his eyes scanning the approaching doors as though he had rehearsed this arrival countless times in memory. The sunlight shifted slightly across the tables, highlighting the subtle lines on his face and the faint glint of his pale blue eyes. Ethan Cole adjusted his stance, moving closer to Walter without drawing attention, his gaze flicking toward each arriving officer and then back to the veteran. Tyler Brooks, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, stepped back instinctively, trying to gauge what would happen next while realizing he had no frame of reference for the presence Walter commanded. Outside the wide glass doors, Rear Admiral Robert Kane and his detail had arrived. Vehicles lined up with disciplined precision, the shadow of authority stretching into the mess hall as the doors opened to admit them. Each officer stepped inside with exacting movements, scanning quickly, then stopping abruptly as recognition of Walter's presence registered. A moment passed where the hall seemed to hang between time and expectation, the low murmur of distant conversations replaced by the quiet acknowledgement of historical significance. Ethan made a subtle gesture toward Walter, who inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the Admiral without rising. Tyler watched, frozen, as every detail officer subtly shifted to maintain a respectful perimeter, their attention locked on the veteran who, at 86, exuded control without a single raised voice. Walter lifted his cup slowly, took a measured sip, and set it down, the faint sound carrying weight across the stillness. Ethan Cole tapped his wrist subtly, signaling to the detail to maintain formation while the Admiral approached, each movement deliberate, measured, and silent except for the soft echo of polished shoes against tile. The hall seemed to draw in a collective breath. Tyler felt the tension pressing against his chest, a physical reminder of authority and history converging on a single figure. Walter's expression never changed. The hint of a small, knowing smile was the only acknowledgement of the chain of events his presence had initiated. As Rear Admiral Kane approached the center of the hall, the room shifted subtly. Chairs adjusted as if to accommodate the weight of the moment, trays were lowered, and all eyes followed the Admiral's steps until they rested on the veteran. Walter met his gaze, calm, direct, and unyielding. The Admiral nodded once, an almost imperceptible gesture loaded with respect and recognition, and the hall responded as if every person had been reminded that some authority is earned, remembered, and cannot be questioned by mere proximity or youth. Tyler's shoulders slumped, realization dawning that the world he had thought he understood was momentarily rewritten by presence, history, and quiet command. The room remained motionless, expectant, and reverent, every detail held in a careful balance, waiting for the veteran's next move while understanding that the simple act of acknowledgement had already conveyed more than words ever could. The doors to the mess hall opened with a controlled precision, and Rear Admiral Robert Kane stepped inside, the sunlight catching the gold trim on his uniform and casting a soft reflection across the polished floors. Every sailor in the room turned instinctively, eyes widening, forks pausing midair, trays forgotten as the figure of authority moved deliberately toward the center where Walter Hayes remained seated. Tyler Brooks shifted uncomfortably, a thin layer of sweat forming on his brow, his earlier confidence completely dissolved by the sheer weight of presence that the Admiral carried. Ethan Cole stepped aside, subtly guiding the hall's attention while maintaining his position next to Walter, whose calm remained unbroken despite the growing tension. The Admiral's gaze fell on Walter, unwavering and precise, and the room seemed to contract around the focal point of their silent acknowledgement. A faint nod passed between them, measured, respectful, a communication that required no words yet conveyed decades of shared history and unspoken understanding. The detail officers moved carefully, forming an invisible perimeter that both protected and honored the veteran, their disciplined movements echoing the rhythm of experience and protocol. Walter reached for his cup again, lifted it slowly, and drank deliberately, as if marking the passage of an invisible moment, his eyes never leaving the Admiral. The mess hall remained suspended in that quiet tension, each observer sensing that they were witnessing something significant, a recognition that surpassed rank or age and touched on legacy and honor. Tyler attempted to regain composure, but the contrast between his youthful certainty and the commanding presence of Walter and the Admiral made his gestures appear clumsy and small. The other sailors shifted subtly, instinctively mirroring the silent respect flowing from the interaction, the air thick with unspoken acknowledgement. Rear Admiral Kane took a small step closer, his polished shoes making a soft sound on the tile, and the hall collectively held its breath, each person attuned to the slightest indication of recognition or command. Walter finally lifted his eyes from the cup, meeting Tyler's gaze with a quiet steadiness, a reminder that the lesson of patience, presence, and unassuming authority carried more weight than any demonstration of force or voice could provide. Ethan Cole's hand hovered near his hip, not in threat but in readiness, a subtle acknowledgement that history and procedure were converging in this moment, binding the room in anticipation. The Admiral paused directly in front of Walter, the nod repeated, slower this time, as though measuring the gravity of acknowledgement. Tyler's jaw tightened, realizing fully that the hierarchy he had assumed had shifted, the old veteran holding the center of gravity not through intimidation, but through the unwavering certainty of his history, his presence, and the respect that had quietly demanded attention from every soul in the hall. The air seemed to vibrate subtly, a resonance of authority, memory, and silent power that left the entire mess hall standing in attentive reverence, waiting for the next deliberate action to complete the chain of recognition and understanding.